My name is Sean Collins. I'm a PhD candidate in Literary and Cultural Studies, and this presentation is part of ASLE 2021's asynchronous conference called Emergency, and the title of my paper today is called Problems in Paradise, Marianne Moore and Eco-Poetics. Andreas Malm, in The Progress of this Storm, argues from a Marxist perspective that the new materialisms of which object-oriented ontology participates is a symptom of ideological obfuscation. By ascribing agency to non-human actors, a now common move within the environmental humanities, Malm argues that O is a flavor of commodity fetishism. Malm argues that it is ideologically dangerous to foreground non-human agency when dealing with environmental concerns. By attributing agency and power to the objects rather than the relations and people behind them, new materialism mirrors exactly the sort of fetishism Marx set out to unmask. New materialism is mysticism and unabashed fetishism. O, or object-oriented ontology, however, takes a different approach. Levi Bryant coined the term flat ontology to describe a distributed notion of agency that refuses to hierarchically categorize between objects. As Ian Bogos adds, all things exist, yet they do not exist equally. Timothy Morton, in Humankind, Solidarity with Non-Human People, makes the exact opposite argument. Morton argues that Marxism doesn't work and therefore will not survive without including non-human beings. And including non-human beings implies also including spectrality, and this means tables can dance, and this means the distance between life form and table breaks down in some sense. Marxism only works if it weirdly embraces animism. Morton provocatively argues that expressing interest in non-humans as equatable to fetishism is a reductionist view of objects in Marxist thought. Commodity fetishism doesn't care whether the thing in question is a golf ball or a nuclear warhead. Caring about things that are not human doesn't make you a commodity fetishist. Not caring about them is exactly what commodity fetishism is all about. A golf ball and a nuclear warhead become value computers, equally blank screens in a virtual stock exchange. We seem to be at a critical impasse for how to proceed with environmental discourse and, by extension, eco-poetics. On the one hand, Marxists argue that a return to objects is a form of fetishism that is apolitical, ahistorical, and worse, a theoretical tool to uphold the status quo of fossil capital within petromodernity. On the other hand, O argues that a return to objects is instead a kind of ethico-political attunement that updates an analysis of capital with the troubling proliferation of non-humans during climate change, or what Amitav Ghosh calls answering our non-human interlocutors. The theoretical debate between Malm and Morton finds its extension in debates about hermeneutic methods within the environmental humanities. Recently, humanists have turned to what Rita Felsky has called post-critical reading, or what Marcus and Bess have called surface reading. For Felsky, Marxian readings are part of a larger interpretive tradition that she borrows from Paul Ricoeur called a hermeneutics of suspicion put into place by Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. Suspicious approaches, Felsky argues, conceive of reading as detective-like interpretation, wherein the goal of hermeneutics is the exposure of ideological obfuscation and oppression. Post-critical readings instead seek to rearticulate how art hooks us, how we develop attachments to art that are irreducible to their context, and how works of art become non-human agents or Latourian actants through the institutional, public, and private networks they participate within. Malm's fetishist approach maps onto a suspicious hermeneutics, while Morton's attachment approach echoes a post-critical sensibility. Take Felsky's description of text as a primary example. All texts teem with meanings that are covert or implied. The shadowy presence of other forms or genres, the traces and residues of their historical moment, the many-layered connotations of words and combinations of words, all texts mean more than they say. Felsky's description of text here echoes Morton's insistence on the spectral or withdrawn quality of objects, which further suggests that post-critical approaches align with a kind of object-oriented or new materialist sensibility. This is particularly true in the use of actor network theory in post-critical hermeneutic approaches. How, then, do these issues apply to environmental representation? More specifically, what kinds of formalist strategies should be championed within eco-poetics? Should environmental discourse and eco-poetics proceed through a suspicious Marxian critique or through post-critical O attachment? More broadly, can we synthesize these modes of reading, or is the only approach for a critical eco-poetics an understanding of nature as commodity versus nature as object? These questions are all the more striking in the case of literary modernism. Modernist formalism and experimentation is one common tool that modernists use to identify their work as innovative and modern. Indeed, modernist self-conceptions of art, as demonstrated in manifestos and many little magazines, are contradictory and seem to me to be unified only through a shared interest in formal experimentation. In what follows, I turn to Marianne Moore's An Octopus as an exemplary modernist nature poem, which is focused on Mount Rainier. By unpacking literary collage in what I will call the poetics of indirection within An Octopus, I argue that Moore develops a modernist flavor of eco-poetics that emerges primarily as a question of literary style. Namely, how should we represent nature in the age of modernity? It is important to note before proceeding that nature is often written out of histories of modernism. Take Ezra Pound's praise of Moore's poetics. Pound states that observations, of which An Octopus is included, has, quote, none of the stupidity beloved of the lyric enthusiast and the writer and reader who take refuge in scenery description of nature because they are unable to cope with the human, end quote. Against this tradition of modernism, I argue that Moore's modernist eco-poetics foreground that how a poet represents the non-human is equally as important as what is said about them. In so doing, I hope to recover a tradition of modernist nature poetry that demonstrates the urgency of formalism for eco-poetics and more broadly for environmental discourse. An Octopus operates as a form of modernist eco-mimesis, where earlier poems about sublime mountains, like Shelley's Mont Blanc, are loco-descriptive and present readers with thick imagery to develop a sense of proximity and immediacy to the environment, which is, of course, the traditional definition of eco-mimesis. Something strange occurs within the opening of Moore's long poem. An octopus of ice, deceptively reserved and flat, it lies in grandeur and in mass beneath a sea of shifting snow dunes. Dots of cyclamen red and maroon on its clearly defined pseudopodia, made of glass that will bend, a much-needed invention, comprising 28 ice fields from 50 to 500 feet thick of unimagined delicacy. Picking periwinkles from the cracks or killing prey with the concentric, crushing rigor of the python, it hovers forward spider fashion on its arms, misleadingly like lace, its ghostly pallor changing to the green metallic tinge of an anemone-starred pool. Readers who are unfamiliar with the poem's subject matter are likely unaware that Moore is detailing the Nisqually Glacier atop of Mount Rainier. Even more strange is that Moore never directly names Mount Rainier within the poem. Moore's poetic diction also doesn't offer a kind of eco-mimetic proximity to the environment, but instead uses scientific diction that estranges readers, seen in choices like cyclamen and pseudopodia that fail to conjure an immediacy to the environment. The formalism of An Octopus is thus deceptively reserved. Furthermore, Mount Rainier has a pallor that is changing, even as Moore's modernist eco-mimesis attempts to make the mountain aesthetically and epistemically present. The operative metaphor that Moore employs, namely mountain as octopus, is fluid, much like the sea of shifting snow dunes that the mountain rests upon within the poem's opening. Readers are told that the mountain is at once an octopus, a python, and a spider in the course of 15 lines. An octopus further suggests both tentacles and glaciers in the way that the poem organizes the space of the page, which leaves gaps and fissures between the lines themselves. Similarly, the lineation and visual design of the poem ebbs and flows, which suggests both fluidity and instability. From a O perspective, Moore's formalism signals a poetics of indirection that attunes readers to what Morton calls the spectral or withdrawn quality of objects. An octopus thus recomposes Mount Rainier through poetic form as a kind of trickster object that refuses to be pinned down epistemologically, ontologically, and aesthetically. Such modernist eco-mimesis ironically demonstrates that the more data presented on the mountain, the more inaccessible the mountain becomes. Indeed, strangeness is a central goal of modernist experimental collage. Picasso, who created some of the earliest collage in visual art, reflected that in collage things become strange and displaced by being forced into new relations with other objects. Quote, if a piece of newspaper can become a bottle, that gives us something to think about in connection with newspapers and bottles too. This displaced object has entered a universe for which it was not made and where it retains, in a measure, its strangeness. And this strangeness is what we wanted to make people think about because we were quite aware that our world was becoming very strange and not exactly reassuring. End quote. For Tim Morton, the uncanny strangeness of the non-human, such as mountains and bottles, arises because the more we come to know about a particular thing, the less we are able to see and thereby know the object at hand. Put simply, with data comes distance rather than intimacy. Graham Harman identifies an aesthetics of what he calls fission to describe the disjunction between data and proximity. Fission, for Harman, is the cubistic presentation of objects by presenting them through multiple aesthetic surfaces. However, the proliferation of surfaces, the more data, through aesthetic fission, Harman argues, demonstrates that an object's qualities cannot be readily identified with the whole. In fact, the idea of parts being larger than the whole is what Morton calls subscendence. It is this subscendent, fission-like quality that is crucial to Moore's modernist aesthetics, as her literary collage creates a veritable hyper-object of surfaces. Within an octopus, Moore's bibliography ranges from the London Graphic, Illustrated London News, Ruskin, Muir, Trollope, Cardinal Newman, and the National Park Service, among many others outside the scope of this presentation. Each stanza thus contains multiple voices and perspectives, as well as actual quotations that aesthetically compose Mount Rainier as an everyday object, precisely in multiplying the formal surfaces, or the data, at hand. And yet, by applying a suspicious reading strategy, one could argue that the withdrawn quality of Mount Rainier demonstrates the exact opposite, namely that non-human nature has become commodified in an octopus, much like Marx's dancing table commodities in Capital. Looking at more sources for the quotations that compose her collage, one learns that a major source text is the National Park's Rules and Regulations Guide. Indeed, the Moore archives, pictured here, demonstrate that Moore borrowed much of the structure of the poem directly from the guidebook, even going so far as to write lines within the very margins of the text. The Rules and Regulations guidebook describes Mount Rainier in a section header depicted here as a glacial octopus, and goes on to state that a study of the map will show a snow-covered mountain with great arms of ice extending from it down the mountainsides to end in rivers far below. The opening of an octopus thus signals to readers that the primary way to encounter the mountain is through the ideology of the national parks and the related issues of preservation, nationalism, and ecotourism. However, the connection between octopus and mountain is also centered in representations of the Mount Rainier Park Company, or MRPC, who developed much of the park's infrastructure. MRPC constructed such iconic park structures as Paradise Inn, where Moore herself stayed while visiting the park in the 1920s. In a political cartoon produced after an octopus, MRPC is depicted as a capitalist octopus astride Mount Rainier's peak. The image's caption from the National Park Service states that, quote, "The company is depicted as an octopus barring all access to roads to the mountain except the road to paradise," end quote. While the National Park's Rules and Regulations thus offers a metaphor to help visitors understand the unique topography of the glaciers on Mount Rainier, Moore's use of the octopus within the poem also signifies that the commercial interests within the park were actively changing the landscape from a wilderness area to an aesthetic, national, and recreational commodity. The connection between collage and commodification, however, is not a new insight. Marjorie Perloff points out that collage has been met with skepticism by Walter Benjamin and Frederick Jameson, precisely because of its imbrication with capitalism. For the former, collage removes the aura from the work of art, while the latter views collage as, quote, "the junks materials of industrial capitalism," end quote. Perhaps Moore's Eco-Poetics in these moments signal that Mount Rainier itself has also become part of the junk materials of consumerism, nationalism, and ecotourism. Moore's formalism within the poem further demonstrates that Mount Rainier is coextensive with advertising and commercial goods. An octopus explicitly quotes and cites popular magazine and newspaper sources like London Graphic and the Illustrated London News within the opening lines of the poem, demonstrated in lines like "Picking Periwinkle" and "Ghostly Pallor" cited above. Such quotations force readers to tease out the relationship between nature and consumerism. In other words, Mount Rainier becomes comparable to the commodities on display in these popular magazines. An octopus thus suggests that nature, in modernity, is inextricably linked to markets of production and consumption. Indeed, later in the poem, Moore explicitly develops the metaphor of mountain as commodity. Quote, "Instructed, none knows how, to climb the mountain by businessmen who, as totemic scenery of Canada, require for recreation 365 holidays in the year." Rather than John Muir's transcendentalist alpinist ethos, which Moore includes in her collage and is outside the scope of this presentation, climbing Mount Rainier has become a transactional commodity for men of commerce. While totemic in the quotation foregrounds the kind of spirituality that John Muir's style of mountaineering advocates, Mount Rainier only has value here as an aesthetic commodity, mere scenery, and a space to exert oneself. Even the common tourist, the new consumers of nature during the rise of the national parks, can only see nature as an aesthetic commodity. Upon looking at the glaciers, Moore quotes phrases she cites as having heard at the circus to the tourists who hike around Mount Rainier. Quote, "They make a nice appearance, don't they? Happy seeing nothing?" End quote. Rather than the trickster quality of Mount Rainier traced above, nature in these moments is merely scenery and appearance. Moore's collage also draws on mountaineer and nature writer W.D. Wilcox's The Rockies of Canada. Such guidebooks speak directly to the aesthetic reproduction and consumption of nature. Wilcox's recording of some major first ascents and explorations of the Canadian Rockies is a remediation of nature for the consumption of armchair mountaineers at home. Like romantic poetry, one need not visit these sublime natural areas because art and media can bring the experience of climbing the mountain into the comfort of your home. The language and rhetoric from the national parks, the adoration of scenery and appearance by eco-tourists who come for the view, and the remediation of alpine adrenaline narratives for a suburban reading audience all reproduce nature as material, national, and aesthetic resource. To borrow from Martin Heidegger's proto-deep ecological language, Moore's collage emphasizes that Mount Rainier is inframed by pressures of capitalism, and thus non-human nature becomes a standing reserve that is set upon and ordered by technologies of advertisement, mountain guiding, and aesthetic representation. As I hope is now clear in this very brief presentation, Moore's treatment of nature and culture in An Octopus cannot be neatly categorized. Much like Bruno Latour's reading of the ozone in We Have Never Been Modern, it becomes impossible in Moore's poetics to tell when when culture stops and nature starts, or vice versa. Mount Rainier, in Latourian parlance, is thus a quasi-object that hybridizes nature and culture without any hope for purification. Perhaps eco-poetics should reflect this tension rather than seek to purify that which is hybrid all the way down. Moore's modernist eco-poetics instead present Mount Rainier as simultaneously a hyper-object and a hyper-commodity. The formalism on display in An Octopus reconfigures Mount Rainier as a trickster non-human object that resists reification, as we saw earlier. At the same time, however, Moore's modernist formalism demonstrates that the mountain is imbricated in circulations of capital, consumerism, ecotourism, and nationalism. Rather than argue that post-critical and suspicious readings are themselves purifiable in the Latourian sense when thinking about eco-poetics, we might instead follow Maurizio Boscagli's argument that, quote, "To matter in the real world, the new materialisms must be open to the history of how any given matter has already been worked on and produced," end quote. While this may seem like mere theory, it is important to remember how drastically Mount Rainier has been impacted by climate change. Paul Kennard, one of the leading geomorphologists studying Nisqually Glacier in Mount Rainier National Park, laments that, quote, "Basically, the whole mountain wants to fall down. We have a tremendous amount of sediment coming off our glaciers, and it's literally filling up our rivers and choking them," end quote. The scene that Moore depicts within An Octopus has undergone significant melting in the nearly 100 years since its publication. The pseudopodia that Moore pays such close attention to in the beginning of the poem has quite dramatically shrunk, leading Kennard and those in the park to view Nisqually Glacier as more of an icy tongue rather than a full-fledged tentacle. Moore's octopus of ice threatens to one day become simply rock and stone as the glaciers recede and turn into roaring rivers on the valley floor. Moore's reproduction of nature in An Octopus is all the more important then because it provides readers with an image of an environmental baseline that is becoming no longer available to readers. Balancing attachment and critique, as demonstrated in Moore's modernist experimental poetics, is thus crucial for helping readers to understand the objectified reality of Mount Rainier as a place that is both beautiful and fragile, both powerful and endangered. Ultimately, Moore's Eco-Poetics, which develop a hybridist aesthetic attunement to nature as nature as object and nature as commodity, provide environmental discourse with a strange and unlikely ally, modernist experimental poetics. Thank you.